Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good morning, everyone. I am Dr. Aslan Shah. Today I am going to talk about management of metastatic RCC. So first of all, we will discuss the background, statics, staging, then how it's metastasized, hematogenous or lymphatic, and then the pathogenesis and molecular basis. Then risk stratification. When a patient come to the OPD, how we can stratify into the favorable, intermediate, and poor risk factor, and decision based upon this. And the majority of the talk would be on the management. So first of all, renal cell cancer is the 8th most common cancer in the men and the women. It was estimated in 2019 almost 74,000 cases were reported in the US. Among this, 16% were the metastatic. So overall, 65% were the localized, 17% were the regional, and 16% were the metastatic. 5-year survival rate basically depends upon the stage of the disease. If tumor is localized, then 5-year survival is 93%. And if it spreads to the surrounding tissue and the regional lymph node, so 5-year survival is almost 70%. And if it is metastatic, then 5-year survival is 12%. So even with an abundance of effective therapies in 2019, 5-year overall survival is dismal. How we can do better? Biomarker to guide treatment, novel approach to treatment, multimodality therapy. We have already discussed in detail in previous presentation about staging. So if tumor is less than 7 cm and limited to the kidney, it is stage 1. In stage 2, it is greater than 7 cm, limited to the kidney in stage 2. And if tumor surrounds the surrounding tissue and even goes into the major veins in stage 3. And this is the stage 4 in which tumors extend beyond the Gerota's fascia and metastasize into the distant regions. So today we will discuss stage 4. This diagram shows different route of lymphatic spreads. These are the here in N regional lymph node in which para-aortic and para-caval retroperitoneal lymph node and Heller lymph node are present. And these are the mediastinal, we consider them as a M1, and pelvic and the inguinal lymph node are the M1. So thoracic duct drains most of the body lymphatic to the and this goes to the systemic circulation through left subclavian vein. So most common site for the lymphatic as well as the hematogenous is the lung. This diagram shows different route of hematogenous spread in which tumor thrombi first of all go to the renal vein, then into the IVC, and from IVC into the right side of the heart, and from right side of heart it goes to the systemic circulation. And in the perirenal veins, it has two pathways. First to go through these colic veins to these portal veins, and then it spreads to the liver and metastasize over here. And other pathway is the gonadal vein, and then from gonadal veins it go into the inferior mesenteric vein. So this is a graph of frequency of metastatic site, and here we can see the lung metastasis is almost twice higher than these nodal metastasis. We can see percentage of lung metastasis is the 45%, and the bone is the 30%, and the lymph node is the 22%, and liver is the 20%, and adrenal is the 9%, and brain is the lowermost, and that is the 8%. So metastatic cascade, the sequence of event takes place from during metastasis. So this is the pathology, we should know about it. These are the tumor cells, and these are interconnected with each other with the E-cadherin. So it basically takes about 4 steps. In first step, first of all, loosening of this intracellular junction takes place, in which deactivation of E-cadherin takes place. And then these tumor cells secretes the proteolytic enzyme, And these proteolytic enzyme, these enzymes have to do is to break down these extracellular basement membrane. So second step is the degradation of this basement membrane, and so in next step these tumor cells invade from extracellular to the intracellular side. So third step is the invasion and these attachment, and in the intracellular it bind with the host lymphocyte and platelet and form the thrombi, and from here emboli, from here it extravasate from intracellular to the extracellular. So fourth step is basically the migration from intracellular to the extracellular, and from on the extracellular sides it's if we talk about the RCC, so lung is the most common site. So deposit and metastasize and angiogenesis and growth takes place. So these metastatic cascade completed in the 4 steps. So signaling pathway is most important in these renal cell cancer, and we should know about that these are the basically growth factor receptors. These are the monomers, and growth factor bind to this receptor site. When these monomers attach with each other, they form the dimer, and here are the tyrosine, and tyrosines attach phosphate group. So these autophosphorylation takes place over here, and RAS protein is basically member of G protein family. So binding protein with inactive RAS, these activated and form the active RAS protein with the hydrolysis of GTP, in which GTP is converted to the JTP and phosphate group is generated over here. So these active RAS protein further generates the 2 signaling pathway. One is the phosphatidylinositol 3 kinase, which further phosphatidylinositol diphosphate converted into the triphosphate with the regulatory step of the phosphatase tension homolog, and then further it goes to the AKT pathway, and this mammalian target of rapamycin that have the complex 1 and 2 that further activate the transcription pathway and the cell cycle. And on the other side, this mitogen activated protein kinase is generated after the activation of the RAS protein, and this both activated the transcription and cell cycle progression take place. So apoptosis is defined as programmed cell death, and mitochondria is responsible for the cell survival or the cell death with the help of this BCL2 family. So these are the triggering factors. If there is cell injury, growth factoring withdrawal, DNA damage, radiation, toxins, protein misfolding, endoplasmic reticulum stress, or chemotherapeutic drugs we are giving, these sensors activate and effect on the BCL2 family. BCL2 family has pro-apoptotic as well as the anti-apoptotic. BAX and BAC are basically the pro-apoptotic protein, while BCL2 itself and BCLX are the anti-apoptotic. So these effect on these mitochondria, and mitochondria secretes the cytochrome C and other pro-apoptotic protein that activate the capsaicin, and this all pathway is controlled by this intrinsic, we call it mitochondrial. And other one is the extensive, we have the DET receptor, we have the FAS and tumor necrosis factor receptor, and these adaptor protein activate the capsaicin. Capsaicin 9 are activated by this intrinsic, and capsaicin 8 are activated by this extrinsic pathway, and these capsaicin activation further executional capsaicin. First, what they have to do is first of all to break the cytoskeleton, and then endonucleosis activity are triggered, so degradation of the DNA and nuclear matrix takes place. So these nuclear fragmentation leakage out to the cytosol, and here these form the cytoplasmic bleb. So these further form into the apoptotic body. These are ligand, these are basically phospholipid, phosphatidylserine. Initially these are inside, but after the breakdown of these cytoskeleton, these are exposed. So these act as a ligand for these phagocytes and the macrophage. So these are phagocytosed and engulfed by these macrophage and phagocytes. So this apoptosis pathway is completed. We have already discussed in detail in the molecular basis basically VHL gene, this is the normal and these are the VHL mutation or hypoxia. We have already discussed it. VHL gene is basically present on the chromosome number 3, and in the presence of oxygen, hydroxylation takes place and form the hypoxia-induced factor alpha, and this hypoxia factor alpha is degraded by the proteasomes in the normal pathway. If there is any mutation or if there is hypoxia, so instead of degradation, this accumulation of hypoxia-induced factor takes place. So further it activates the VEGF receptor, glucose, platelet-derived growth factor, and the transforming growth factor. So this is the normal VHL gene in which hypoxia-induced factor in the presence of oxygen and hydroxylation, and then further degradation by the proteasomes. And in this diagram we can see there is mutant VHL, and in this hypoxia, so there is accumulation of these hypoxia-induced factor that further activating these RR. And in this diagram, these accumulated HIF activating the growth factor that acting on these monomer activating the dimer, and these signaling pathway is activating, we have already discussed. So here we can see platelet-derived growth factor, vascular endothelial growth factor, endothelial growth factor. These are all activating these both signal and transduction pathway, yet further at the end point is the angiogenesis, cell proliferation, cell survival. So here we can see there is angiogenesis is taking place with the help of this VEGF and platelet-derived endothelial stabilization and autocrine growth stimulation by the transducer. And chemotherapeutic drugs are basically acting on these target. So here we can see different targeted therapies like sunitinib, sorafenib, and pazopanib acting on vascular endothelial growth factor, and this sorafenib is active on the endothelial growth factor, and this sunitinib pazopanib is also acting on the c-KIT, and these vascular endothelial growth factor, anticolonal monoclonal antibodies are affecting on this. And here we can see this targeted therapy acting on platelet-derived growth factor, and here we can see this hepatocyte growth factor. These are also these are acting on this, and everolimus and temsirolimus, these are the acting on the mammalian target of rapamycin. So these targeted systemic therapy drugs are affecting on all these. So evolution of imaging in 1950s, only X-rays were going on. Then later on, with the time passage, imaging modality has evolved, and so in 1970s, ultrasound were added, and then in 1980s CT scan, and then 1990s in the MRI. So in the 21st century, PET CT and PET MRI are going on. So biopsy in case of metastatic RCC, biopsy is indicated in all metastatic RCC to know about the clear cell versus non-clear cell. Mostly 80% of the clear cell and 20% of the non-clear cells containing on the chromophobe, papillary and collecting duct, and also to know about the primary or secondary origin of these tumor. So this is the CT cap, and here we can see with the contrast, and here we can see this is the heterogeneous large right renal mass, and in this axial window, and this one is the coronal, and this is the lung window. In here we can see this is the left-sided subcentimetric lymph node in the lingual. So if patient is allergic to the CT guided contrast, so MRI is option for this.
If you go back to the last one, the previous one. Yes, you see, you have shown that PET scan is actually the final thing. It's not the final thing. What's happening is there is always a medium or a molecule which has got an affinity for metabolism. For instance, so what we have these days with us is FDG. The next thing is choline. The other thing is fluorine. So we have got many different chemicals which are ligands, which are actively metabolized by tissues, and they have got their own affinities, their own likings. So this field is rapidly progressing field, which is PET-CT. So PET-CT is not something which is just PET. It has to be added with another active molecule, which is actually a metabolizable molecule. So this field we have to look into in a separate presentation.
Thank you.
This is something which is it's not controversial, but it is something which is debatable. At this point in time, what we understand is PET-CT scan is available for certain pathologies as a prognostic sort of a tool rather than diagnostic. So they are not primarily used in assessing any tumor, for instance prostate cancer or testicular cancer, or any cancer in the body which is hidden somewhere, and you have got you have got a gut feeling that my patient has got a cancer somewhere in the body, so let's do PET-CT. It's not something which is still on, but again this has got its value. Maybe in future 2-3 years, 5 years down the line, it becomes part and parcel of something which is just plain CT. We have got contrast enhanced CT. Now we have got another CT which is PET-CT. You have got multi-parametric and biparametric CT. So there are many ways of exploring and exploiting a technology. So this is something where we have to just open our minds, keep a window for any advancement that comes in. Don't shut it since it is not a primarily introduced modality, so it cannot be in future. It can be in future, but provided we sort out something which are still unanswered.
Patients present with incidental finding to the highly symptomatic disease, and when patients come in OPD, we have to determine is it is in favorable, intermediate or poor risk factor, and treatment decision is based upon basically on this. And what we have to treatment goal is the prolonged survival as well as the good and high quality of life. So this is the IMDC International Metastatic Database Consortium criteria, that comprises on the 2 clinical and the 4 laboratory investigation. Karnofsky performance status is less than 80, and its time from diagnosis is less than 1 year, and hemoglobin is less than the normal limit, and neutrophil count, platelet and the serum calcium is greater than the normal limits. So these are in the IMDC criteria. If there is no any factor, that is the favorable. If there is 1 or 2 from this, that is the falls in the intermediate, and if greater than 3, that is fall in the poor risk. And so 70 to 80% are newly diagnosed are intermediate and poor risk. In 2019, in 2009, 500 patients were treated with the systemic therapy, and 43 months favorable risk was noted in overall survival with the systemic therapy in the favorable, while in 23% in the intermediate, and 8 months in these poor risk factor. So performance status is if the normal is 100, if able to perform normal activities with minor symptoms is 90, if normal activity with some symptoms are 80%, if there is unable to do normal activities is the 70, if he needs any OVL assistance, that is the 60, and if the patient requires considerable assistance is the 50%. If patient is disabled, it falls in the 40%, and if severely disabled, that is 30%, and very sick is the 20%, and near about to die is the 10%. So basically we divide the management of metastatic RCC into 2 groups. First is the local and other is the systemic. In local therapy, if patient is symptomatic and if patient fall in the favorable risk group factor, and then there is indication of cytoreductive nephrectomy. And if patient is oligometastatic disease, has solitary metastasis, then indication is the mastectomy, and here it noted that in the complete resection 5-year survival was 44 to 50%, and there was not complete resection, then 5-year resection was 12%.
So what is the indication for starting new adjuvant therapy in the context of metastatic RCC?
If patient has poor performance status, and if patient is fall in the intermediate or poor risk factor, and patient is asymptomatic, so we have option to go on the systemic therapy. And
so you see, just yesterday when I was taking the round, there were 2 cases which were done 1 day prior. One had radical nephrectomy, the other one had partial nephrectomy. So I had 2 questions to ask. One is, for partial nephrectomy to go with robotic assisted platform, there was no nephrometry score that was actually has to be calculated. One thing. So that's a criticism. And that is a healthy criticism. The second thing is, the case with the radical nephrectomy, there were multiple deposits in both the lung fields. So it was to start with a metastatic RCC. My question was, has there been any discussion on starting something called first-line therapy, which is a new adjuvant therapy? So everybody was looking here and there. You see, now the onus has to be on the surgeon, because surgeon is the one who sees the patient for the very first time in the clinic. So if there is a discussion between the surgeon and a medical oncologist, again the responsibility is on the surgeon, because he is or she is the primary physician. Since urology is the field which is taking everything along, medical oncology comes second, so there has to be a statement that yes, we have discussed, and these are the criteria which we have pointed out earlier in the previous slide. According to IMDC classification, these are the risk stratifications. We have opted for the second option, third option, the first option, just because of the reasons of these that you are telling us. Maybe it's a poor risk performance, maybe it's a good performance of patient where you want to do something which is cytoreductive surgery for the very first instance. The second impression is, whenever from now on the things are changing, you are appearing for exam, or you are appearing for anything, or maybe you are just sitting in the clinic and the patient can ask you this question: why you are opting for surgery up front? You say to him or her that this is called cytoreductive. So what is the definition of cytoreductive surgery? Why you are reducing the tumor burden? If you are in search of an answer, that means that your mind is not clear. So please clear your minds, because these are the formative years, the residency. So if you are a resident, you are thinking a lot, you are reading a lot, please make up your mind that once you are certified as a consultant, you must have an answer. You can't just bagle nahi jhaan sakte. Okay? So these times which are coming, and they are already here, आपके जो है ना वो दहलीज पे आ गए. Everybody would ask you a question. If you have labeled me as metastatic RCC, then there is a trial called Carmina trial, and that says that either you do surgery, or you do which is cytoreductive surgery, or you do something which is neoadjuvant therapy. They have got equal results. So it's better to have a kidney which is safe and a therapy which has been given with probably a little bit of complications, but they can be managed. So we have got a clinic here in SIUT that is especially for metastatic RCC. It's on every Wednesday, and this is especially for those who have got these kind of problems. Right? So you all have to be in pace with what's happening around you, within the institute and out of the institute. Otherwise you will be lost. You will be lost in chapters, you will be lost in algorithms, you will be lost in pathways, you will be lost in molecular biology. So please do something stepwise. Otherwise, it will make no sense of reading something called RCC or anything else. So that's my plea to all my junior colleagues. Please start thinking and putting everything together. It's a jigsaw puzzle. It will become more complex if you don't put everything in perspective. So let's talk about it, please. You see, if you have got a patient whom you want to discuss with another colleague in another hospital, and he has got a stag-on calculus, so we just move from this subject. Now, if that stag-on calculus patient is being referred to some other person, and that some other person happens to be a learned person, so you would always like your patient to go to a learned person. And what would you say? I have got a stag-on calculus on left side of the patient. It is actually covering all the calyces and this and that. But if you don't say anything about Guy's score, your statement, your summary, your referral would be substandard. It will not be taken any respect with it. So you see, these are the languages. These are the parameters in which we have to write down our notes. If you don't express something, as Haris was saying, called nephrometry score, if you don't put these things into perspective, you will not be taking anything forward. You are not reflecting yourself as a person, a learned person, a worthy person, so that there is a discussion amongst the persons. So this is a field which is, I think it is evolving, but we need to learn the language, and this is the language. So if you don't start learning language, you won't be able to comprehend, you won't be able to communicate, you won't be able to just express yourself properly. So that's my view. I respect everybody's statement, whatever the assessment is, but you have to write it down. You have to write it down to someone who wants to learn, that person might be a senior person, that person might be a junior person. But if learning is a process which has to go from cradle to grave, then it has to be done. So if I have got a feeling, maybe a positive feeling or a negative feeling, I should write it down in some words which are respectful and that explains my position. Since anybody has got the right to decide that this case goes towards one direction or the other, but it is also the right of all the other persons to know why that direction has been taken. Otherwise, a tertiary care hospital will not be a tertiary care hospital. A tertiary care hospital and a teaching hospital has got a double sort of a responsibility. You are teaching someone, you are training someone, maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously. Maybe I am not so communicative, maybe I am a very sort of a dull person, I am not active, but I want to learn. And I want to learn something from my seniors. So I always follow my seniors, whatever they write. If they don't write anything, if they don't say anything, if they just do something which is just a scolding and nothing else, I'll be directionless, targetless. I have got no direction in my life. So my training is actually incomplete, or rather, there was no training. So that's my thing. You see, we live in a community, in a society, at least in this institute, where everybody is listening, everybody is talking, everybody is actually observing each other. They are seeing me, I'm seeing them. Maybe we don't communicate, but we've got this judgment. They judge me, I judge them. Right? It's better that we judge each other on something which is a written sort.
And now what will be the future course for this patient? Surgery and having medicine.
So whenever we see these small so-called nodules, so what we do is we operate them and then we follow up on CT scans after 6 months and clearly that are these nodules increasing or they are remaining the same. Most of the cases what I have seen, I haven't seen any data regarding that, but they remain the same and we haven't seen specifically that they are growing and all. Maybe it is the case otherwise. And whenever we see a small nodule like this and we label it that the CT scan labels it as metastatic, and when we discuss personally with the oncologists, they also say that maybe it is a simple lesion. So why go for such an expensive drug for so long? So why don't you do an nephrectomy and take it out and let's see and observe it? But things are changing at a fast pace because now the cost is the issue of a developing world. It is not an issue of the other side of the world.
So in this case, there is no role of target.
I think, sir, we have got a way to go forward, and the way is what the rest of the world is saying. the rest of the world is taking this renal pathology the same way as bladder pathology. And that was my actually plea to all my colleagues from medical oncology, that please start thinking, please. And that was something which was going on for the last 5 years. We asked them to please start thinking in terms of neoadjuvant as well as adjuvant. So what you are talking about is something called adjuvant. Now there are drugs which are available. We know the pathways as has been discussed earlier. We know what they are doing. We can't just say that let's put our patients, since we are a poor country, we don't afford anything. Let's put our patient on a fast lane of surveillance. Let's call them every 3 months so that we can do CT scan chest and see whether these lesions in the lung they go off on their own. This is something which is ridiculous in today's world. This is something which nobody would buy. This is something which everybody would call you stupid, because economics won't play its role unless and until proven otherwise. So if you are hiding behind economics, you can't say anything about your own patients. So let's strive, let's move forward. The whole community, it's not that the surgeons community or the medical oncologist community. If something is available for these patients, let's talk about economics. Let's solve the problem. If it is available, if it has got an importance, if the analysis and the statistics show that it has got maybe 30% or more than 30% response rate, let's use them. Why you want to put your patient in the basket of just active surveillance?
So thank you. RCC is basically a radio resistance tumor, and if there is symptomatic brain or bone metastasis, then radiation therapy is indicated either through the conventional or its stereotactic. So this is the timeline of approval. In 1995, first FDA approved was the high dose interleukin 2, and that was in 2005, first time targeted therapy sunitinib was approved. And later on, this was the targeted therapy area from 2005 to 2015. In 2015, immunotherapy, nivolumab was adopted and was approved. And 2018 was the tremendous year when combination immunotherapy was approved. So, high dose interleukin 2 cytokine era, first FDA approved for RCC and only get with long term remission 10 years. And here in this graph, we can see that most beneficial group was the favorable risk group factor. So this is the comparison between the pre-TKI area and after TKI area after the IMDC, and here we can see is huge difference between the favorable, intermediate and the poor risk factor, and after the targeted therapy, these are all beneficials. So there was comparison done with the sunitinib and the cytokine interferon alpha, and here see that there was the progression-free survival was greater or larger than these interferon alpha, and that was the 11 months for the sunitinib and was the 5 months for this one. And after treating with the sunitinib, 31% was the response rate, objective response rate was noted, while with the this interferon alpha 6% response rate was noted. So cabozantinib was adopted as the first line and the second line, and cabozin study done in the 2016, and that was compared with the sunitinib, and in this side you can see that progression free survival was the 8.2% in for the cabozantinib and 5.2 was for the sunitinib. So after treating and after imaging, that was noted that objective response rate was for the cabozantinib was the 46%, while for the sunitinib was the 18%. So cabozantinib was also adapted for the second line therapy. So in METAR study, it was compared with these mTOR inhibitor everolimus with these this one, and here you can see these the free survival as well as overall survival. That is the difference between these two arms. Axitinib is the last targeted therapy, that is the selective oral potent VEGF inhibitor that studied in second-line setting after patient failed sorafenib. Overall response rate is the 22%. Given intolerability has been combined with immunotherapy with impressive results. So approved with the PD-1 and PD-L1 inhibitor. So T cell is a main part of the immune system. Our immune system is needed to kill the cancerous cells. So these are the tumor cells and these are the T cells, and CTLA4 and PD-1 are expressed on these T cells. And if there is breakage in these CTLA and PD-1/4, that results in allow upregulation of immune response targeting tumors. And this is the immunotherapy, and this is the 2015 era in which nivolumab PD-1 inhibitor was approved. So in Checkmate study, it was compared with the everolimus and was noted the overall survival that was comparatively higher than this mTOR inhibitor. So this is the 2018 era in which this is a combination immunotherapy, nivolumab and ipilimumab, that was both were compared with this the sunitinib, that is the targeted therapy, and here we can see the response rate. So this one is the basically response rate noted with the comparison between these two arms. And here we can see progression-free survival, and that is noted at the 12 month and the 24 months and the 30th month. And this is the overall response rate, that was the 42% with these combination therapy, and that was the 29% with this targeted therapy. And overall survival rate we can see in left sided of this graph, that at the level of the 12 months, 24 months and the 30 months, that is higher. So this was that was basically for the intermediate and poor risk factor, and this one is for the favorable risk factor, and here we can see the difference. So after 3 months follow-up, complete response was noted. About 11% disease was eradicated with these combination immunotherapy in the intermediate and poor risk factor, while 8% complete response was noted with the favorable risk group with these combination therapy that was approved in 2018, and that is also an impressive. So our goal of treatment is high survival as well as the quality of life. So here we can see in this graph, this line that shows the combination therapy that approved in 2019, and this one is the sunitinib, that is the target therapy. So quality of life improved in these combination therapy. So these are all risk factors noted in these combination therapy as well as these targeted systemic therapy. No doubt these are toxic, but one good thing is that these are manageable, and beneficial is this, that we can get long progression-free survival or overall survival as well as the best quality of life. So this is the basically a combination of targeted therapy. This is the oral VEGF, and that is this immunotherapy, that is the PD-1 inhibitor pembrolizumab, and these both combined, and overall survival was noted over here. That is the pretty good. And here we can see this is the overall response rate, that is the 16% with these combination with the oral VEGF as well as PD-1 inhibitor, while in sunitinib we can see that is the 35%. So Javelin 101 study designed to compare these oral VEGF as well as avelumab, that is the PD-L1 inhibitor. So compare with the sunitinib, and here we can see these their progression-free survival in the favorable, intermediate, and low risk factor, and there is a difference between these combination therapy as well as these targeted therapy. So this is overall a keynote study that done for the oral VEGF as well as PD-1 inhibitor, and Javelin for the oral VEGF and with the PD-L1 inhibitor, and we can see 60 and 35% with these this combination, while PD-L1 inhibitor 51% overall response rate was noted. So overall, if we net calculated, then the objective response rate was noted with this trial with the combination PD-L1 and oral VEGF was the 59%, 51% in case of PD-L1 inhibitor, while in this targeted therapy 39% was noted. So these are all basically the adverse effect and toxicities that noted with these combination therapy, that was the diarrhea, hypertension, and increased impairment in the liver functions. But one thing was that was the manageable. So this trial was done, Emotion 151, that was for the non-clear cell, that is the 20% comprises on the collecting that chromophobe and the papillary, and targeted therapy was compared with these monoclonal antibodies. So overall objective response was noted in non-clear cell, that was the 26%. So these are overall year by year response rate that was noted in 2007, 3, 13, 17, 7, and this is the 17, 18, 19, and this one is the 19. And here we can see this one target therapy and PD-1 inhibitor, and this one is the targeted therapy with the PD-L1 inhibitor, and we can see this response rate, that is the in case of PD-1 inhibitor, that was the 59% for the PD-1 and 36% for the this targeted therapy, and overall progression-free survival was 15 month was for this PD-1 inhibitor, while 11 month was for this targeted therapy. So these are AUOU guideline recommendations, and here we can see that these stratify on the base of IMDC criteria into the favorable and the intermediate and poor risk factor. And in case of if it's favorable risk, then standard of care is the pembrolizumab and axitinib, means PD-1 inhibitor and the targeted therapy. If there is resistant, or if a patient can't receive this, then these targeted therapy are indicated. And in case of intermediate and poor risk factor, these PD-L1 and targeted inhibitor targeted therapy as well as these immunotherapy are indicated and as a standard of care. And if patient can't receive it, then these are the options. And if when we talk about the second line drug therapy, if patient has taken already immunotherapy and he has taken the oral VEGF, but not taken the he has not taken previously in combination with this anti-VEGF, then we have the next option for this. And if he has taken already systemic targeted therapy, then we have standard of care is this nivolumab and cabozantinib, that is the first line as well as the second line therapy. So this is the summary. Rapidly changing standard first line therapy, we likely have many new treatment options for our patient, making treatment options very exciting yet complicated. Combining VEGF or receptor TKI with immunotherapy improves clinical outcomes. For oligometastasis disease, we utilize multimodality treatment combined with systemic therapy to improve the cure rate. Immunotherapy based regime offers the best chance of achieving patient's goal. So need biomarker study to help us sort out who should get what therapy and who will respond. First of all, PD-L1 expression, then CD8 expression, and gene expression profile and multimodal burden. We need to develop novel imaging multimodalities to predict response or resistance therapy. We need to expand our ability to analyze treated tissue samples. How can we do better? Biomarker to guide treatment, novel approach to the treatment, and multimodality therapy. Thank you.